The move has the rest of the world asking, what is America's future in global affairs? Early Start's special coverage begins right now. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Early Start this Friday morning. Good morning. I'm Christine Romans.
I'm Victor Blackwell in for Dave Briggs. It's Friday, June 2nd, 4 a.m. in the East. Now, this morning, the United States is no longer a global leader combating climate change. President Trump announcing he is withdrawing the U.S. from the Paris Climate Accord, a process that will take until November 2020 to complete. Now, the sweeping move fulfills a campaign promise, but it's prompting sharp backlash from nations around the globe.
Speaking from the Rose Garden, the president said he wants to renegotiate key parts of this agreement, but there are stark warnings this morning that the U.S. is ceding a leadership role it has held, shaping world events since World War II. Our coverage begins this morning with Jim Acosta at the White House.
Christine and Victor, key U.S. allies are telling President Trump they are not willing to renegotiate the Paris Climate Agreement. Leaders from France, Germany, and Italy are all telling the White House there will be no renegotiations in response to the president's comment that he would like to strike a better climate deal. But the president made it clear during his speech at the White House that he's thinking more about key voters in states like Pennsylvania than the U.S. allies that are now disappointed that the U.S. is withdrawing from the deal. Here's more of what he had to say.
It is time to exit the Paris Accord. And time to pursue a new deal that protects the environment, our companies, our citizens, and our country. It is time to put Youngstown, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, along with many, many other locations within our great country, before Paris, France. It is time to make America great again.
The president's daughter, Ivanka, had been pushing the president to stay in the climate agreement. She and her husband, Jared Kushner, did not attend the president's speech. A White House official said they were observing a Jewish holiday in the morning, but the official noted Kushner opted to keep a pre-scheduled meeting at the White House rather than attend the president's speech. Christine and Victor.
All right, Jim, thanks. Now, you heard Jim mention France, Germany, Italy, all swiftly pushing back against the president's intention to renegotiate parts of the climate deal. CNN's Melissa Bell is in Paris for us this morning. Let's bring her in now for more on the response from key European allies. Melissa, good morning to you, and the response has been sharp.
Sharp. There is a great deal of anger here in Europe this morning, Victor, and Europe is really waking up to a very different world, one in which, this is the belief amongst many European leaders, the United States simply no longer represents the ally that it did until yesterday. And it was very late last night that this announcement came European time, and yet Emmanuel Macron, France's new president, still chose to take to the airwaves. Here's what he had to say.
We all share the same responsibility. Make our planet great again.
Now, there is this anger partly also at the language that was chosen, that very nationalistic language that was chosen by Donald Trump, a reminder really of where he stands on these issues and the fact, therefore, that Europe is simply going to have to look elsewhere. Later today, the European Union and China will be issuing a joint statement from Brussels talking about their commitment to the Paris deal and their intention to work together to make it move ahead faster. And you've been hearing reaction from all over Europe this morning, a great deal of anger. I'd just like to share with you what Martin Schulz, the former president of the European Parliament, tweeted this morning. You could leave the climate deal, but you couldn't shy away from the reality of climate change. He tweeted, more specifically, Donald Trump, you cannot simply push aside this reality as you can leaders, a reference, of course, to what happened here in Europe last week. Victor.
Yeah, the president suggesting that the U.S. will try to renegotiate or negotiate a new deal. Macron saying that is not in the cards. Melissa Belfort there in Paris. Thank you so much.
All right, with the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, U.S. rivals are stepping up, China earning praise for sticking with its commitment to fight climate change. One European leader warning that if America steps off the world stage, the Chinese are in a prime position to fill that vacuum. Let's bring in CNN's Matt Rivers for more on Chinese plans. He's live this morning in Beijing. And certainly in terms of propaganda and public relations, it's a beautiful moment for China to step in and say, oh, we will be a leader in the world. We will continue to move forward with all of the technology and money we've spent on fighting climate change, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also a very easy sell to their domestic population, because the fact is those of us that live here have to deal with some of the worst air pollution in the world. We feel the effects of pollution here almost every single day in the air quality that we're forced to breathe. But now China does assume a leadership role in this climate agreement, whether it wants to or not. It is the biggest economy left in the agreement. It is the biggest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. And because of those two facts, it has the biggest ability to create change on a global stage. And because of that, other countries around the world are going to be looking at China and not the United States for an example. There is the concept that they're going to follow the leader here, and China is apparently more than ready to take on that mantle. And if you look at what China has done over the past several years, coal use has dropped over the past several years. They have set to invest almost $360 billion US by 2020 in clean energy development projects. So they are putting their money where their mouth is at this point, taking on that leadership role, whether they wanted to or not. Now, at a Ministry of Foreign Affairs briefing earlier today, the Chinese wouldn't criticize the United States the same way that European leaders did. They would only say that they would stay the course, that China would stay the course in this particular agreement and stick to its commitments. But in state-run newspapers, specifically a tabloid called the Global Times, they called the U.S. withdrawal from this agreement very reckless and selfish.
Christine. You know, we're just showing some video of Chinese cities, man, and it's clear that China itself has a really big self-interest in lowering these emissions. I mean, if China wants to keep social unity, as they always say, right, the authorities always say, they need to make sure that people can go to school and people can go to work. And so I would not be surprised if China does emerge as a leader in green technology and the like, just simply because of the pictures we're showing there. All right, Matt Rivers, nice to see you in Beijing this morning.
All right, so the U.S. is out of the Paris Climate Accord. Critics are saying its influence on the world events will be diminished, and America could find itself taking a back seat on other critical global issues. Let's go live now to London and bring in CNN's Frederick Pleitgen. And Frederick, how does this, if we're seeing the indications early, this withdrawal influence other multilateral alliances that the U.S. will be facing in the next few years with this new administration?
Yeah, I think there could be fairly big influences, and I think some of the European leaders, even before all of this happened, even before President Trump made his decision, were already saying, look, it's very hard for us to see how we see eye to eye with the United States if the views are so fundamentally different on climate change, because of course this whole climate change agreement is embedded into international politics, and it's certainly something where, for instance, in the future, if you have trade disputes between the U.S. and China, where are the European countries going to stand if they have deeper trade ties with China all of a sudden, because the U.S. is sort of ceding its leadership role on climate change, especially with a lot of these economies moving more towards an environmental technology economy than they have before. So those are some of the things where perhaps in the World Trade Organization you might see European countries look differently at things than maybe they have before in those kind of disputes. On security matters, it's going to be interesting to see what happens there, whether or not the Europeans still believe that generally they can rely on the United States. Is something, of course, where Angela Merkel was quite critical in the past week of President Trump, saying, look, we're not really sure we can rely on the specific White House. It'd be interesting to see whether or not it would damage any sort of security alliances. Not sure whether it actually would, but certainly a lack of trust is never good, and certainly opens up a vacuum where, as Matt just said, the Chinese seem to be doing everything they can to try and move into that vacuum to become a premier partner, for instance, for the Europeans, not just as far as the environment is concerned, but of course on the back of that also as far as trade is concerned as well. And of course countries that trade very closely with one another usually are also quite intertwined politically as well. So certainly this could have very, very big repercussions, and that's something that many European leaders warned about before. The head of the European Union warned about it. Several European heads of state warned about it as well, Victor.
And we'll examine all that throughout the morning. Frederick, thank you so much.
All right, President Trump says the Paris Accord is a raw deal for American business and American workers. But guess what? Business leaders do not agree with this president. Top CEOs took to social media to express disappointment over the president's decision to withdraw. Big names like General Electric CEO Jeff Immelt, Apple's Tim Cook, Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg, Tesla founder Elon Musk, and Disney chief Bob Iger quit the president's business council. They had been advising this president. It even inspired Goldman Sachs CEO Lloyd Blankfein to send his first ever tweet, writing that the decision is a setback for both the environment and the U.S.'s leadership position. Hundreds of companies in every industry support this deal in finance, consumer products, and tech, and even oil companies. That's because corporate America says the president is looking backwards, while clean energy and tech is the future. They don't want to cede the U.S. Its competitive edge to China, Russia, or Europe. And now the president and critics say the Paris deal, of course, is a jobs killer, but job growth in clean energy is outpacing the old school industrial sector. I want to show you some numbers. For example, last year the solar industry grew 17 times faster than the average. Solar also employs more than twice as many Americans as coal. Climate change is a business risk, and companies already made plans based on lowering their carbon emissions. They won't change course now. Many of these companies say they are going to proceed as if Paris were in effect. But they are outraged. Business leaders are outraged, except the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal. The standard bearer for business says this was a good move, calling the Paris deal a pledge of phony progress and sort of mocking the outrage of green elites. So the Wall Street Journal editorial page, the different view than all these CEOs.
You've heard from these CEOs that they disagree with the president's choice. You've also heard from mayors and governors who say that they will stay on path. We'll hear from
It'll take 4 years to really get out, right? And so I've been hearing from business leaders and hedge fund managers late yesterday, who said, all right, 3 to 7 years, this president won't be the president anymore. We need to think beyond a Trump administration.
Yeah, we'll hear from the mayor of Pittsburgh later. You know, the president invoked Pittsburgh yesterday. Now, President Trump with stirred words also after dozens are killed in Manila. Watch.
It is really very sad as to what's going on throughout this situation. It is really very sad as to what's going on throughout the world with terror.
So the president feeling strongly about that, wanting to point that out at the Rose Garden yesterday. When the White House was asked why President Trump mentioned terrorism, a senior official said the president had been briefed that media reports indicated ISIS had taken credit. It is not clear what media reports they are talking about.
The Trump administration petitioning the Supreme Court to reinstate the president's travel ban. The Justice Department asking the High Court to lift lower court rulings that halted the president's executive order. The travel ban would temporarily bar travelers from 6 Muslim-majority countries. Now, the administration argues it's a matter of national security. Critics call it a discriminatory ban on Muslims.
All right, high drama last night. We're not talking about the NBA Finals. The National Spelling Bee stretched.
Set to speak about U.S.-Russia business relations. Executives from several American corporations will be at the Economic Roundtable in St. Petersburg to listen to his pitch. Now, the event comes one day after the Russian leader denied his government interfered in the U.S. elections, but he did suggest patriotic hackers in his country may have independently played a role. Let's bring in CNN's Claire Sebastian live from Moscow. 2 big questions. Why now? And is it possible that there could have been these independent hackers without the Russian government knowing about it?
Well, Victor, it's certainly possible. I think it's important to be careful not to overinterpret this. As you say, President Putin still denying any government involvement, but the point he was making was that there could be independent actors out there. But that again emphasizes the Russian government's position of deniability. First they're saying that even if you do establish that the hack originated on Russian soil, then you have to establish the link to the Russian government. Obviously, we know the U.S. intelligence agencies believe that there was a link, but from the position of the Russian government, there is still deniability. On the question of why now? Well, Putin is the star of his own show there in St. Petersburg, and I think that's why we see a kind of a franker, more vocal style from him, perhaps also emboldened by the fact that we see what Russia perceives as a waning position for the U.S. on the global stage, pulling out of the Global Climate Accord. They saw, the G7 achieve very little, and then those comments by Angela Merkel about how Europe can no longer rely on its traditional allies. But I think it's interesting how Putin's tone has evolved. He addressed his friendship with Trump directly, saying, I've never met him, so I can't be friends with him, but he called him a sincere and straightforward man, said he had a fresh approach and that this might lead to good things. The two are set to meet in July, just over a month away now at the G20 summit. So perhaps he's starting to set the agenda for that. But we are expecting to hear from him in the next couple of hours, again addressing U.S. business leaders. So we may get more details then, and maybe more sense of what he's planning and what he's up to.
All right, Claire Sebastian for us in Moscow. Thanks so much.
All right, the date has been now set. James Comey will testify next Thursday before the Senate Intelligence Committee. The former FBI director is expected to detail private conversations he had with President Trump. He's also certain to be asked whether the president urged him to drop his investigation into fired National Security Advisor Michael Flynn.
Meantime, letters newly obtained by CNN show 2 Democratic senators have asked the FBI 3 times to investigate Attorney General Jeff Sessions for possible perjury. Senators Al Franken and Patrick Leahy say they are concerned that Sessions lied at confirmation hearings about his meetings with the Russian ambassador. Now, a source says that so far they've had no response from the FBI.
And now this, a word you may have never even heard of, let alone spelled.
From the Paris Climate Accord.
And with that announcement, the future of America's role shaping global issues suddenly is in doubt. President Trump pulls out of a landmark climate accord. So the question is the U.S. abdicating leadership to some allies and some adversaries? Early Start's coverage continues right now. Welcome back to Early Start. I'm Victor Blackwell, in for David Briggs.
Nice to see you this morning. I'm Christine Romans, in for Christine Romans. It's 31 minutes past the hour and a lot to get to this morning. The United States is no longer a global leader combating climate change, folks. President Trump announcing he is withdrawing the U.S. from the Paris Climate Accord, a process that will take until November 2020 to complete. This sweeping move fulfills a campaign promise, but is prompting sharp backlash from nations around the globe and business leaders here in the United States.
Now, speaking from the Rose Garden, the president said he wants to renegotiate key parts of the agreement. But there are stark warnings this morning that the U.S. is ceding a leadership role it's held shaping world events since World War II. Our coverage begins with Jim Acosta at the White House.
Christine and Victor, key U.S. allies are telling President Trump they are not willing to renegotiate the Paris Climate Agreement. Leaders from France, Germany, and Italy are all telling the White House there will be no renegotiations in response to the president's comment that he would like to strike a better climate deal. But the president made it clear during his speech at the White House that he's thinking more about key voters in states like Pennsylvania than the U.S. allies that are now disappointed that the U.S. is withdrawing from the deal. Here's more of what he had to say.
It is time to exit the Paris Accord. And time to pursue a new deal that protects the environment, our companies, our citizens, and our country. It is time to put Youngstown, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, along with many, many other locations within our great country, before Paris, France. It is time to make America great again.
The president's daughter, Ivanka, had been pushing the president to stay in the climate agreement. She and her husband, Jared Kushner, did not attend the president's speech. A White House official said they were observing a Jewish holiday in the morning, but the official noted Kushner opted to keep a pre-scheduled meeting at the White House rather than attend the president's speech. Christine and Victor.
All right, you heard Jim mention France, Germany, Italy, all swiftly pushing back against the president's intention to renegotiate parts of this climate deal. CNN's Melissa Bell is in Paris for us this morning. I want to bring her in for more on the response from these key European allies. Good morning, Melissa. And I understand that the French president, the new French president, pulled out his English to give a speech late at night about the outcome here.
That's right. First here in France, we have a president who can speak English almost fluently, Christine. The response really from Europe has been swift and it's been united and it's been fairly angry. I'd just like to show you a couple of the headlines here in France this morning. Goodbye America there on the front page of Libération, referring to the fact that Europe really considers that it is saying goodbye to its historic ally, not just on climate, but perhaps in a broader sense. And Les Echos, Trump there provoking the world. That is the headline, and that is very much the sense here in Europe as the continent has awoken to this news. I've just been speaking to Laurent Fabius, France's former prime minister, also the man who presided over those negotiations a year and a half ago here in Paris, the man considered the architect of the climate deal. He said that in a sense this was a fault on the part of Donald Trump against humanity and against the world. I asked him specifically about the concrete challenge that now presents itself if this deal is to hold, which is the $3 billion that the United States had been due to contribute to the poorest countries in order to help them them achieve their targets. He said that inaction was simply not an option and that therefore that money would now have to be found. But really, there's been a sense of uniting around this common cause of wanting to fight back and, in a sense, move ahead faster, perhaps, for the rest of the world in light of what the United States has announced this morning. Paris's mayor, Anne Hidalgo, has held a press conference very much in that vein, along those lines, saying that the Paris deal will live, Christine.
All right, Melissa Bell in Paris for us this morning. Thank you so much for that.
China is vowing to stick to its commitments to fight climate change, promising to be a, quote, responsible party after the U.S. bailed. And one European leader warning that if America steps off the world stage, the Chinese are in prime position to fill that vacuum. Let's bring in CNN's Matt Rivers for more on China's plans. He's live this morning for us in Beijing. And what are we hearing that this withdrawal means for China?
Well, whether they're ready for it or not, China becomes the de facto leader of the fight against climate change for those countries that remain, the 194 countries that remain in the original Paris Agreement. And why is that? Well, China is the biggest greenhouse gas emitting country in the world, and China is the largest country, largest economy that remains in the agreement. And because of that, China has the biggest ability to affect the most amount of change. And other countries, smaller countries, will be watching what China does here. You know, if China sticks to its commitments and if they are the biggest greenhouse gas emitter, then other countries could possibly look at it and say, well, if China can do it, so can we. There's a very kind of natural follow the leader aspect going on here, and China does appear ready to take on that role. China says it's going to stick with the climate agreement no matter what the United States does or does not do moving forward. China has said that it will invest $360 billion by the year 2020 in clean energy development projects, and it has shuttered already this year 104 either planned or new coal power plant construction sites. So they do appear to be putting their money where their mouth is. Now, in terms of responding to the U.S., the Ministry of Foreign Affairs didn't directly criticize the U.S., saying only that China will remain in this agreement, but a state-run tabloid newspaper called the Global Times, in an editorial, called the U.S. withdrawal reckless and said it was an example of how the U.S. can be selfish and show its irresponsibility. Victor?
All right, Matt Rivers for us there in Beijing. Thank you.
All right, critics say America's influence on world events will now be diminished, and America could find itself taking a backseat on other critical global issues. I want to go to London and bring in CNN's Frederick Pleiken. You know, the president, very, very clear here that he is talking to a domestic audience. He is talking to his base who elected him. He made promises. He's going to keep those promises for American workers. How is that playing where you are?
Well, I think it's playing very badly, especially with a lot of European leaders. You know, one of the things that's been so interesting over the past couple of days was where, you know, leadership in Washington, you had H.R. McMaster, but the president himself as well, saying, you know, that it's going to be America first, and also that America was going to have a different style of leadership. And now you're having a lot of European leaders who are asking, you know, where is American leadership? What's it going to look like in the future? And they're obviously already going in a different direction. They're trying to foster deeper trade ties, for instance, with these Asian countries, for instance, with China, for instance, with India, but also deeper political ties as well. And that's, of course, also something that is going to show on the world stage, especially when you have things like potentially trade disputes between the U.S. and China, which is something that could potentially happen. I mean, you've